Hello everyone, welcome to the channel again. So this video will be on, I'm trying to kind of prove that the 80s is actually one of the best eras for comic books, if not the best. But then again, it's subjective because, you know, the golden and silver age were so impactful for comic books. Many of the characters from the silver and golden age, the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, were very important for the modern comic books, and even those books helped make the 80s what they are. But I feel like the 80s is a very important era of comics, and a lot of things that were introduced in the 80s have impact on the movies and the other comic book series and various forms of media we enjoy today. So I tried to find a couple indie comics during the 80s while possible. Because people were turning out comic books not under Marvel or DC in the 80s. I went through my shelves and could only really find two, but there's several more. I mean, just because it was the 80s doesn't mean that comic book publishers weren't turning out books back then. So the first book from the indie scene that I could pick up, then I thought, okay, this is from the 80s, is The Crow by James O'Barr. The Crow was made in the 80s. It spawned movies, a movie franchise, and in and of itself, it's a cult classic and one of the best indie books I've ever read. Another one would be the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were created in the 80s, and frankly, from an indie book in the 80s, it has gone on to inspire movies, reboots, successful series. Funny thing about the indie books, the original run from the 80s, is that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #1 had a very, very small print run. It was basically created from two guys pulling their tax return together and setting out, or that's how the story goes, I'm not sure, but they didn't have a large amount of money to print it, but they printed it, and it has a significantly small print run. It's a miracle that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles had taken off from something printed basically just a shot in the dark to something where now it's a multi-million-dollar, if not billion-dollar franchise. I'm not sure if it's worth a billion or a million. It's worth a lot of money. Okay, so a large portion of this, the 80s being the time where I feel comics had gotten good, starts with a successful miniseries from DC that happened during the 80s. So in and of itself, this series has spawned several other really good comic book series. Is in and of itself a good comic book series, and that's Crisis on Infinite Earths. This is basically DC's attempt to streamline its continuity down. So basically you have one Earth where everything happens. There's no universe. It all gets funneled down into one. You get the characters from the JSA, the Shazam family, the Charleston comics, all on one Earth, and they're all interacting with each other. Then that's where it starts, is Crisis on Infinite Earths. Now, of the three most popular DC characters being Wonder Woman, Superman, and Batman, each one of them actually had a a successful series that was spawned from Crisis on Infinite Earths. For Wonder Woman, you had George Perez's run on Wonder Woman, which I feel is the best run on Wonder Woman. And actually does a really good job modernizing and making accessible the Wonder Woman origin. I kind of begrudgingly, the new 52 origin, or the more modern origin of Wonder Woman, is okay, but I really prefer the George Perez's origin for Wonder Woman. Batman got the Cape Crusader, which had Jim Starlin on it. And Batman had the John Byrne's Man of Steel run. Basically, this is probably the first reboot of Superman since. And it's a pretty good retelling of Superman. And the funny thing is, the Wonder Woman and Superman stories kind of intersect with each other. There's possible romance between Wonder Woman and Superman, but will they, won't they? Other series that spun off fairly well was like John Ostrander's run on Suicide Squad, which introduced the concept of Amanda Waller running the Suicide Squad, and them getting bombs implanted in their necks to make them compliant. This one started pre-Crisis, the Crisis on Infinite Earths book I mentioned earlier, and this is my run on Teen Titans by Marv Wolfman. That one, the lineup of that Teen Titans introduced to us pretty much the roster that they used, minus a few characters like Wonder Girl. They didn't use Wonder Girl, but they used Robin, Cyborg, Beast Boy, Raven, Starfire. So that series pretty much spawned the animated series. DC. Oh, here's another one. This one I think went into the 90s, but I would consider it from the 80s. Is Justice League International. The Justice League International run was pretty good. It was more comedic. It was more comedic than a normal Justice League book. You had different characters like Blue Beetle, Booster Gold, Guy Gardner, acting more comedically. Then you had different writers who were pretty good. Like, I think this is when writers like Alan Moore and Grant Morrison were starting to take off as writers. Well, I think Alan Moore was working well with DC beforehand, but like pre-Crisis, he did What Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, which was from the 80s. He also did The Killing Joke. Another book he made, another series he made, was his run on Swamp Thing. Books I don't have currently. I have them. I just don't know where they are. You have V for Vendetta was written during this time. Probably his most popular book, Watchmen. And Watchmen is actually considered one of the greatest graphic novels of all time. Grant Morrison was turning out things like Animal Man. Let me make sure Animal Man's actually written in the 80s. I believe it is. Yep, started in 88. So you got Animal Man, a lot of Grant Morrison stuff. Started in the 80s and went into the 90s. Much like this title, Doom Patrol. Anything from Grant Morrison during the 80s is pretty justifiably a hit. This Doom Patrol run inspired the the live action series. Then you have guys like Frank Miller, who were big during the 80s. He created stuff like Batman Year One, Batman The Dark Knight Returns, and then getting into these Marvel, he created the modern a lot of elements that are continued today in Daredevil. He created characters like Stick, Elektra, the concept of the hand ninjas. It is actually pretty funny because I mentioned something where Frank Miller created the elements of the hand, and he created the characters like the hand. Oh, you know what? We're going to have to put an asterisk by this one because he started working on stuff for Daredevil in 79. So almost in the 80s, but a large portion of his stuff was from the 80s. So kind of an asterisk. Frank Miller Daredevil was actually in 79. So such a minute difference that I didn't even realize it. For the sake of the video, I'm going to allow it, but it did start in May of 79. And to be fair, he worked on Daredevil in 79, but I don't believe he took full. I don't believe he was the full-time writer. Yeah, I think he didn't start working on Daredevil until the 80s, I believe. He was working on it, but he wasn't writing it. Yeah, Roger McKenzie was the writer for a little while. Let's see if he made it to the... Alright, so... But it's kind of funny, the concepts that Frank Miller introduced in Daredevil went to inspire Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, so... The 80s artists and writers actually influenced each other to create better stuff. This book, this run, is from the 80s. We have Daredevil, Born Again. I just got done reading Brian Michael Bendis' run on Daredevil, and Born Again actually takes a lot of stuff that was introduced in Frank Miller's work and uses it, but then that's kind of the consequence of comic books being episodic, is that these are characters living in a universe, and they don't forget what happened in a certain length of their time. So, you know, their past affects their present. So, Marvel, as I showed you, Daredevil during the 80s was pretty good. I don't think Daredevil is prone to bad runs, so another series that was in the 80s that's really good, The Secret War. This would be the first one, not the more modern one. I've read them both, and this one's still my favorite one. I like Secret Wars. Also introduces us to the black suit for Spider-Man, something that has ramifications to this very day. 2 more left, and I could probably have pulled more Marvel books. I just found a lot of stuff from the 80s for DC. Walter Simonson's run on Thor is really good. It introduces concepts like Beta Ray Bill. I think it impacted. I think this run on Thor was kind of an inspiration for Thor Ragnarok, the movie Thor Ragnarok. And another series that I feel was pretty good during the 80s, and I try to see if I could pull some. And it's Hulk by Peter David. Peter David's Hulk run was pretty good during the 80s as well. It introduced us to concepts like Joe Fixit, the Gray Hulk, the mob muscle Gray Hulk that worked in Vegas when Bruce Banner was presumed dead. He showed up in Vegas, and to this day, Peter David is still writing Hulk stuff, and it's still really, really good. I'm not really a fan of Hulk stuff like this run of Hulk, World War Hulk, Planet Hulk. I even like the Red Hulk stuff. But yeah, I do believe the 80s is a very, very good time for comic books. And then again, you could have watched this entire video and said, well, I didn't like a single one of these things, and I didn't like anything that these comic books made happen. And, that's fine. Again, when I title this video and say the 80s is the best decade for comics, it's very much subjective, because it's very much my point of view of me reading a series and then being like, oh, this came from the 80s. So, it's very subjective. And it's kind of funny because a lot of these are just a matter of who was active writing during this time. Like Frank Miller was turning out his best stuff. This was back when Alan Moore was putting out stuff for DC, and it's some of his best stuff. So, it's very subjective, and maybe you don't like Watchmen. I didn't like Watchmen the first time I read it. But these books are classics and they grow on you. I like them. I kind of feel like the 80s. I kind of feel like the 80s impacts the modern movie era of comics, the cinematic universes, and that's cool. But I don't know, maybe I'm just nostalgic, and this is nostalgia. I feel, and it's kind of a thing for me, and people will argue it, but again, you can't argue somebody's opinion. If I say this is what I think, you can't really argue that. But I think that the era of the 80s is actually superior to the comic books of today. I feel that these books are funner to read than a lot of the books that are out today. But I am also optimistic that, no matter how sparse the comic book climate out there is, you could walk into a comic book store right now and find a run on a comic that's currently being printed, be they from DC, Marvel, or Image, Dark Horse, or just anywhere, and those comic books are going to be. There's going to be at least one good run in a comic book store that sells out or is widely acclaimed. You're going to find a comic book. You go into a comic book store right now, you'll find a comic book that you'll enjoy, that everybody can enjoy. But that said, that about wraps it up. We have I'm looking at all these books, and there are a lot of books here that are some of the best from the 80s. But again, I could probably scour through my books and actually find strong contenders from the 90s, the early 2000s, even the 70s or 60s. So, and if anything, if you take nothing else away from this, you'll at least find some good recommendations for reading from the 80s. And as you can see, a lot of these have large print runs and collected editions. So these books are going to be fun to read. And they're very thought-provoking. I like them because a lot of them are thought-provoking. Alan Moore and Grant Morrison are very thought-provoking authors. But that said, I'm going to wrap this up. These Teen Titan comic books are probably going to fall over on me. If you can think of any good series that I left out, and again, I wanted to include Chris Claremont on X-Men, but I didn't because it was from the mid-70s. I let the Daredevil one squeak by, just because a lot of Daredevil stuff happened during the 80s, and that's really when Frank Miller took over the run and started doing the really cool stuff with Daredevil. But that said, if you can think of any books from the 80s that you like, and I think there's probably some really good manga from the 80s. I'd have to look into it. I think Dragon Ball Z was getting started. Not Dragon Ball Z. Dragon Ball was getting started. I think that's when Gundams was from the 70s. Anyway, there's probably some manga from the 80s. Maybe I can do a little bit of research and see if I can do a companion piece to this video about just manga from the 80s. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed the video and my stacks and stacks of books from the 80s. Thank you very much and have a good day.